Hi, I'm Glenn Timmerman, the owner of Horseshoe Bay Farms, and we're about to set out on a tour of the farm property, the farm buildings. One of the unusual facts about the farm is that from the time of beginning of construction to the time of completion was just 2 years, and that was 1916, 1917. They built 17 farm buildings and 5 farmhouses in that period of time, which was unheard of. Typically, farms in that date evolved over a period of a decade and a half, so they were up and operating in 2 years. A little bit about the farmhouses. To my left here was the main manager's house where the manager of the farm raised his family. Just next to the manager's house is what was typically the assistant farm manager, a little bit smaller house. As you move south, the next house was where they fed most of the farm help. There was a full kitchen in there. There was a freezer, a big walk-in cooler. There was an indoor and an outdoor eating area. Next to that house was what was called Walter's house. Walter Weezy was the herdsman for about 40 years and really kept the cows, kept the dairy herd. And lastly, there was a fifth house, the furthest south, which housed farm workers. The first barn, what they referred to as Barn 1, or the cow and crop storage barn, the main floor was all hay and straw storage for the animals. And we'll take a walk around and get down into the second level. All of the barns are in remarkably good structural shape. The previous owners, about 12 years ago, had a group of Amish workers that they bussed up here from Seymour during the summer to reinforce all the roofs. And using all wooden pegs, all original timber kind of cuts. And so all the barns are in exceptionally good shape. This is the milking parlor. There were 40 milking stations. You can see the brick floors that they had and concrete floors. Very unusual for 1920 or so. Usually it was all dirt floors. They had iron stanchions to be able to separate the cows. At the far end is the creamery. We'll take a walk over there and I'll show you the creamery. So the milk was drawn by hand and put into buckets. The buckets were emptied into larger milk cans. So the milk cans were brought into the creamery, and early in the 1920s, the way they were kept cold was by bringing bay water up in here, and they placed the cans in the bay water in buckets to keep the milk cold until they could send it for processing. Later on, they used ice cut out of the bay to help keep the cans cold as well. So this area was never refrigerated in the heyday of when they had dairy cattle and when they were a breeding farm as well. So you can picture all of these cans stacked in here in buckets of water or with ice packed around them full of cow's milk. There are separate rooms in the milking area that were used to segregate cows that got sick or cows that were close to birth. They were having difficulties. Rather than keep them in with the herd, they would put them in these pens, in these stalls in this separate room. second barn over was called the bull barn. And in the days of the breeding of the Holsteins, they probably had up to 4 bulls that they kept in this barn. These 2 pens here with concrete walls and steel toppings here were the breeding pens. So they'd take the dams from the milking barn, and they'd take the bulls here, put them together, and in these 2 pens is where all the action happened. The bull barn would also, there would be calves that would occupy part of the space as well. But again, you can see concrete floors. The bull pens were significantly larger than the cow pens. They had plenty of room, and some of the calves would be housed in here. Everything up above in this barn, it had its own hay and straw storage as well, so the bulls would be separately fed. The hay could be thrown down from up above into this area down here, and the feeding would proceed. So the cows had their own hay storage, the bulls had their own hay storage, and the calves as well. One of the unique things is just look at these barns. Every one of them had ceilings, wooden or otherwise. They all had plastered walls. This is 1916, 1917. Not wooden walls, plastered walls. It was only the best when the farm was constructed. Now, as I'm looking out at this grassed area here, what occupied this area was a very large, to my left, a very large hen house, and you can see some of the concrete pads over there that are left. In fact, the major part of the hen house was 1 story tall, and then it extended out off the back. And that front part of that hen house is now sitting as a guest home near the Alpine Golf Course. One of the previous farm managers' kids asked for it, and they took it, transported it, and built a guest house. From all the chicken coops all the way up to this next barn, these were calf pens. So outdoor calf pens for the calves to be outside. There were long, narrow slots, and then rectangular components where they would occupy the space out here. And the chickens were, they raised Rhode Island Reds and white Leghorn chickens. Much of it was used to support the farm workers and the farm families, but much of it was sold as well, both the chickens and the eggs. Now we're going to move to the horse and the mule barn. So prior to the advent of tractors, everything was wagons. Everything was pulled by horses. The horse and mule barn housed anywhere from 4 to 6 2-horse teams. Each team had a handler. The handler was responsible for feeding the horses or the mules, cleaning them, brushing them every day, giving them baths every day. And they really had a strong relationship with their team to keep them in good health and keep them in good shape to be able to work the farm. As you can see, we use some of the barns for storage. In fact, the golf club uses it for storage of some of their fertilizers and equipment when they're not using it. But again, look at the construction of the barn: wooden ceilings, plastered walls, brick and concrete floors. And in fact, you can actually see the indentations where a horse probably got a little excited because of a storm or something, and were kicking and stomping with their hooves right here. Several of the areas where the where the horses would go have those kind of indentations. And it is amazing to me those go back 75 to 80 years. They had a separate area in each barn where if one of the animals got sick, they could separate them from the rest of the animals. So in the corner there was another little area where they could take one of the horses in case it got sick. All of the feed was up above. All the hay and straw and other feed was up above again. So each barn was like a self-sufficient structure for the animals that were in it. The farms were so complete that they actually had a water pipe that would come in here. And this was a drinking area for the horses. And they actually pumped water in here. So as the horses came in from a busy day, they could stop and they could have a good drink and not have to be led someplace else to get their water. The barn in back of me, on the lower level, was a root cellar, probably an ice house to cut ice from the bay, and then it was actually an infirmary. And in its heyday, they had their own veterinary surgeon and an operating theater set up in a part of the barn. And we'll take a walk in there and see what those two areas look like. So this is what was called the infirmary. Any sick animals were eventually brought here from the other barns. They actually had an operating table, an operating theater, and harnesses that hung from the ceiling here. And you can see that at any one time there might be 6 or 8 animals in here that were being cared for. Again, the barn was, the idea was the farm was to be completely self-sufficient. Highway G, which runs along the bay from Murphy Park, didn't exist at the time. In fact, the Murphy family loaned the village of Egg Harbor $3 million to build that first road from Murphy Park into the village. And it's unclear whether that loan ever got paid back. So did the Murphy family actually build that road? I think they did. The other side of this barn here on the lower half was what was called the root cellar. And I believe it was both a root cellar and at one point ice storage when they cut blocks from the bay. And it's really quite an amazing structure on the inside here. Complete concrete structure, almost like a bunker, including concrete ceiling. And this must have been some fruit cellar and quite an ice house during the winter as well. It had no refrigeration up to a certain point. You can see some of the old refrigeration units as they were probably put in the 40s and the 50s. But what a massive space for keeping produce or keeping ice, depending on what time of year it was. They had the small farms, the farmer trying to eke out a living. They had the larger farms that were evolving. And then they had wealthy people who wanted to get out to the countryside and have their own farm. And of course, they wanted their farm to look the best and to make some money to keep it going. But this was probably one of the more sophisticated show farms in the state of Wisconsin. It also produced a lot of fruit and it did quite a breeding operation and had quite a milking operation, but it also, the owners wanted it to look nice. That was all about showing I had the best farm, the cleanest farm. Showing meaning showing off. To my right here was another barn where they kept and raised hogs. And there was a huge hog pen outside of that, Jersey Duroc hogs. And they sold those hogs for probably 40 years during one point in the existence of the farm. And the building's gone and obviously the hogs are gone. And back of me is what was called the test barn. And it really had several different lives to it. And the first and most important life was when they were breeding Holstein cattle in the 1920s, all the cattle production, all the milk production, the butterfat production, everything was brought in here, tested for diseases, making sure it was clean, it was weighed, and all the critical statistics were created so they could track their cows and promote their cows in terms of the amount of production and the amount of butterfat they were producing. And then they would improve the breeding process at each stage along the way to get more milk and more butterfat production year after year after year. So the test barn was critical. It was really the data center, if you will, of the 1920s that really helped to promote and sell their cattle at auction. And all of that was done in here. In its second form, after the Holstein breeding operation died off, it was converted, it was insulated and converted into a fruit barn. So after the cherries or the apples were picked, they'd be stored in here, apples would be sorted, they'd be packaged, put into boxes, and got ready for shipping. So this whole thing, from one end to the other, was sort of the processing facility for the fruit. In its third incarnation, it was a beef cattle barn, and there was one kind of beef cattle on one end, one kind of beef cattle on the other end. I think that lasted for about 7 or 8 years, and then they got rid of the beef cattle. And lastly, now we use it. There's a business that operates out of here. It's a landscape maintenance business that does all of the landscape maintenance work for the homeowners associations up at Horseshoe Bay Farms Development. And as we walk through it, that's what you'll see. You'll see it set up to support the lawn maintenance work. So if you take a look at the ceiling, you can see the insulation, probably put in the 1940s. So this was kept at probably about 60 degrees, 55 degrees when they were processing and sorting all the fruit and storing it in here. And this was just one large processing facility for probably 3 decades. But again, now we have offices for the Horseshoe Bay Development Company, which is the landscape maintenance company. We've got offices, we've got a place for storage of our equipment. We're all still very proud of the Horseshoe Bay Farms name. We display it wherever we can. And our machine shop to keep all the landscape maintenance equipment operational. And in fact, the farm always had a woodworking shop and a machine shop. And I'll point out in a minute where that structure was. These are the original bench and original drawers from the machine shop. So these go back to 1917. And we just pulled them over here and use them now. And in keeping with the history of having a machine shop and a woodworking shop, we've also got our own small little woodworking shop in here because we do have to do building maintenance for the condominium associations as well. So almost 100 years later, here we are with our little machine shop and our woodworking shop just like they had on the farm. And then we just have additional storage area for equipment and everything at the far end of the barn. There was another major barn that sat lengthwise connecting these two barns. You can see the footings over there. It was called the calf barn. And the calf barn was where they would take the dams when they were just ready for birthing, and they would give birth in the calf barn, and then the calves would stay there for a certain period of time. And that barn was built to very exacting standards. They had absolutely pristine concrete floor, and they had special thick plastered walls. It was almost like a hospital room, if you will, because they wanted to make sure that the birthing process was completely clean. Well, it seemed like a great idea, but any animal gives off a perspiration and a certain moisture content, and after about 5 years, all the plaster was falling off the walls, and they eventually had to remove the barn. And that's why some of the calves were put in the bull barn and moved around a little bit. So it's a great idea to make sure every calf lived through the birthing process, but they sort of overbuilt the inside of it. Conveyor system here that connected this barn to this structure right here. This was called the manure shed. That same conveyor system came from the bull barn and came from the calf barn, so they had it all connected. And what ran on the rail of the conveyor system was a very large bucket that they pushed by hand. And they'd push it into the barn. They would, with a shovel, scoop out the manure, put it into the bucket, move the bucket on, and each day they would go from barn to barn filling that bucket. It would then be brought all the way to the manure shed, and there was a spreader attached to either a wagon or to a tractor later on, and they'd dump the manure in the spreader. At the end of the day, the spreader would go out to the fields and it would spread, particularly the cornfields. They would use the manure, but they also used it for some of the orchards up on the bluff. This process was quite advanced. Nobody had this kind of a conveyor system for decades. And secondly, the manure shed had a concrete floor too. Why not, right? But it certainly was a lot easier to hose down and clean up. So in fact, it could actually take 2 wagons could be put in here, and you can see how the conveyor system could move back and forth here depending on how deep in the wagon was or the truck. Just to my right here in the back of me was the powerhouse. Later in the 50s and 60s, they called it the gas station, but it had 2 diesel-powered turbines that provided all the electricity for all the barns and for all of the houses. In addition, it had a backup battery system. So if the turbines went out, they could still keep things going with the batteries. This farm in 1917 had hot and cold running water in every house, had complete septic and toilet systems in every house. It had electricity in every house and every barn, in every barn it had hot and cold running water as well. It was, again, about 15 to 20 years ahead of its time. So the whole farm was completely self-sufficient, and this was the power plant that did it. This is where the power plant was housed. The farm buildings over here were just used for storage, wagon storage, early on, tractor storage, other machinery storage. In the back of that building, there were actually overhangs built. So the cows could be out in the pasture here, and if they wanted to get out of the sun, they could move them in under those overhangs. And in addition, all these hand-built stone walls that went all the way around the property, they were pens for the cattle to graze or the cows to graze. They actually had a water pipe running along the side of them, and at certain points they'd have a concrete bowl where the water pipes would enter into, so the cows could actually get water while they were out grazing. Again, a very unique feature for any farm in that day. And lastly, you can see the remnants of the foundation of what was called the machine shop. And this is where, on one side, early in the day, it was called the farrier shop, because that's where they would put horseshoes on all the horses. Eventually it became known as the machine shop. It actually had a machine shop on one side of it and a woodworking shop on the other, and it had dormitory space up above for farm workers. And that burned down about 15 years ago. So this is the original weigh scale. You can see the weights here and the scale that was operational for weighing feeds and other things that were brought in or things that were produced and were leaving. And again, this is the original scale from the construction of the farm back in 1917. So the weigh station, the wagons or the trucks would come onto here. They knew what the weight of the wagon or the truck was, and then they would weigh the entire thing with whatever the contents were, hay, corn, or other farm byproducts, and they could get an exact weight, and that would be the basis for what they were listing that they were selling. Horseshoe Bay Farms, the pride of the Murphy and the Coles families, an internationally recognized Holstein breeding farm, the largest employer in Door County as a fruit producer, a tremendous asset for the county, a real treasure, the largest intact farm complex in the state of Wisconsin. You just had a chance to get a little peek into its history and its structures, and I can tell you, as the next caretaker, it's a great pleasure for me to own this property. Thank you for joining me on the tour. It was a pleasure having you, and as you can tell, I really enjoy talking about the farm.